Hi everybody, this week we're going to cover Chapter 6, How to Script the DOM with JavaScript. Now the DOM, as you might remember from HTML class, stands for Document Object Model. It's the order of the tags that we use in our markup. So the way HTML works, so we'll go into this in depth, but just know that this is going to be a very important part of how JavaScript interacts with HTML. And a lot of what's taught in this lesson will be used on the job. And you'll see that when I show you the example scripts that come with the text. So let's get started. Okay, so our goals here are to develop DOM scripting applications that work specifically with forms and controls. So forms just means the entire form. Controls are the inputs that are inside the form. They include an input type of text area, the larger text input, drop-downs, checkboxes, radio buttons, those are all controls. So we're going to have to know forms really in depth. That's why in the HTML course we spend so much time on forms. They're very, very important. So we'll be using DOM scripting in a couple of applications that will add, change, alter, and show different nodes or elements to the DOM. We're also going to be using Chrome's developer tools to view the changes that JavaScript has made to the DOM. So Chrome developer tools are great. I mean, all the browsers have some developer tools. Chrome's are spectacular for this because you can see what JavaScript is doing and rendering to the DOM. So by the time you leave Chapter 6 here, you should know how to use the DOM in JavaScript applications. You should be able to describe properties of what we call the node interface. And those include parent node, child nodes, first child, last child, next element sibling, node value, and text content. Now, right now, you should already be drawing associations between the HTML tags that you know are parent tags of other tags. Take an unordered list or a UL tag, for example. We know that ULs contain LIs, if you're familiar with the unordered list, of course. So that is where we get parent-child relationships. So when you hear something like parent node and child nodes, those are all elements that are related to each other, but based on the document object model, because that is what tells ULs to contain LIs. Now, you'll need to see this, of course, but that's kind of a nutshell of what we're going for. You'll also need to describe the methods of the document interface for the DOM. And that includes the query selector, which we've already done, but we haven't done the query selector all yet. We've mentioned it once, but we haven't done it in an application yet. Also, you'll need to describe the methods of the element interface for the DOM, which means has attribute, get attribute, set attribute, and remove attribute. Now, for you to know that, you have to know the word attribute, which is anything that has an assignment inside an HTML tag. So when you say something like image source equals, the source is the attribute. We're also going to be able to explain how the DOM HTML spec can simplify our coding when compared to the DOM core spec. So we're talking about targeting specific HTML tags instead of working with the entire DOM. So we're going to need to use the class list property, which is exactly what it sounds, the list of classes. We're going to have to be able to describe the use of a form that has a submit button and a reset button. So we'll be covering the get method and the post method in here. We'll be talking about how we reset and how we can actually submit data and what happens when we submit data. So you're going to have to know the form elements, so we'll review those. Text box, text area, select statement, which is the dropdown, and radio buttons and checkboxes. Those are all of those have to be in your arsenal. You also need to understand the form methods. So those methods include submit, which submit a form, reset, which resets the form, focus, which puts the cursor into the element that you focus on. Blur is the event that happens when we leave each input type, and select is what happens when we select it. We'll also need to describe the events for working with controls. So all those input types, focus, blur, click, double click, change, which we apply to dropdowns, and select. So we've got all these methods that can call JavaScript functions, and we need to know how those events are applied. We'll also need to describe the process of using append child or insert before. It sounds weird even though it's inconsistent. Append child will place an element after an element. And insert before would insert it before. And those are methods of the node interface, which add nodes to our DOM. So let's take a look at code that has a form in it, okay? Take a look at right after the H1 tags here. We have form, ID equals email form, and name equals email form. Action equals join.html, method equals get. Now, that form tag has 4 attributes: ID, name, action, and method. The ID makes the entire form accessible via document.getElementById. The name field is an attribute that sends values to a server-sided script. We can access the form by using either the ID, as you know, or using the name, or using the form itself. The action is where we're going to be sending the data from the form. So the action would determine the recipient of the form. So what's coming in? Well, it's going to be an email address, but it's just join. So I'm going to run this in code real quick just to show you a little bit about the overview on this thing, okay? So what I'm going to do is take a new script here. We're going to call it form.html. And I am simply going to run it real quick. So let me just close out some stuff. We're going to go to form, and I'm going to just type in my email. Okay, typical, right? I hit enter. Look what happened. See how it says join question mark email address equals kdccore %40ereg.com. Well, why did that happen? Well, because we are using the get method, we sent the values via get method. So I'm just going to make another domain here. Hit enter, and there it is right there. Boom. Okay. %40 has replaced the @ symbol because it's punctuation. The question mark starts what's called a query string, which are pairs of data. Now that said, notice how the join.html was the action attribute of what we just did. So knowing that, we can go back to our form, get back to our presentation, and take a look. So we have label for email address label. So that means that when we click on email address, the cursor will go into the text field. I can run that real quick for you, just as a demonstration. We hit refresh. Watch what happens when I click on the label here. Oh, the focus comes into play. We have the cursor right inside there. So that's very handy. We have a span ID with a star for email errors. So once we have an error, what we can do is just fill that ID, target that ID with the error messaging. So knowing that code, let's take a look at the document object model for that specific web page. And I might toggle back and forth for a second, but we have 2 top-level elements, head and body. That's true because if you look, we have head and body. Below that, we have title, which is a child of the head, and maybe some text, which is a child of the title. In our case, we had join email list as the title. Now, what about the body? Well, we have 2 top-level elements there. We have an H1 and a form. The H1 has text. That text is please join our email list. Then we have our form, which has label, input, and span. Label for email address, the input type equals text, or in this case, it really should be email because it's an email address. That's an error with the text, which, you know what, just because it's bothering me, it really should be this. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that when you use a mobile keyboard, that you have the email keyboard there when you use a mobile phone. So input type email would open up a keyboard with letters and the @ symbol. And once again, we have the span. So this is the document object model with levels for that previous web page that had the form. Now, nodes. The nodes that are commonly used are document, element, attribute, and text. So these 4 keywords are going to be targets for when we target the DOM. We can target an element's text, we can target its attribute, we can target the entire element itself, and we can also target the entire document. And some of the properties of the node interface will be something we've already said in the second slide. Parent node, in the past case, the parent node was the body tag. Child nodes, which might be title, or form. Those are child nodes of those parent nodes. First child and last child are self-explanatory. Next element sibling would be the element itself, but the next element that is on the same level. The node's value are the values in between, and the text content is the text content in between. So like a node value might be like an input type. If you look at this form and you look at input type, email address, name, address, what got entered into that input type is the value. So now that we know some of the keywords, let's take a good look at something like a span element with 3 child elements. In this case, we have a span tag, a bold tag, welcome, an underline tag, which is back, welcome back, question mark, which is in italics again. So bold, underline, and italics. If we want to get that element object, we could use document.querySelector and just put the word span in there. Span would get that value. So constant span is that object and everything inside of it. Now, if we want to get the text from the span element with the node value property, we can do something like this. lm text span, which is the constant, dot first child, not node value. Well, let's take a look at that. The first child is what? Bold. Dot first child, dot node value is going to be welcome back. So let's take a look at this. When we do console.log blm text, this should be welcome. This should be back. So let's take a look at welcome and back. First child, second child, third child. Go back, first child node value. That is first child node value. Go back to here, lm text. This is the ulm text. That equals first child, next element sibling, first child dot node value. So let's take that first child, which is the bold tag, find its next element sibling, which is the u tag, target its first child, which is the back, the text itself, and the value of that back. So take a look at this again. Span, which is the whole thing. The first child, right? First child dot next element sibling, which is the u, right? And then the first child of the next element sibling, which is the value itself, which is back, and then the node value of that. So that is welcome back. It gets confusing, but if you have your console up and you're targeting that and you console.log each thing, you can kind of work through it. So when we do node value, we get welcome back. If we do span text equals span.text content and we log that, all it does is take the text content completely from it. So once again, if we look at this and we call it the text content, it would grab welcome back and then the exclamation point. Okay, and notice how there's a space after welcome in the bold tag. That's to target that. So that explains the node value property, a little bit about first children, next element sibling, last child, and it says welcome back. So there you go. Have fun, right? Real easy. It's really not. I can't do it, honestly, without really target. Well, first of all, you have to make sure the HTML is perfect. If the HTML is poorly constructed, that presents a problem. And I can't do it without the console generally. I will console my children and their next element siblings until I get the target, and then we're good to go. It'll usually take one round of trial and error, and you're good. So on this slide, we're going to talk about how to set the text of a span element's first child element. In this case, we're going to do span, which we know what that is. First child dot text content hurry space. And if we console.log span text content, because we replace the text content with hurry, it doesn't say welcome, it says hurry back. Now notice the equal sign at the top there. If we did plus equals, it would equal welcome space hurry back. But now when we log span.text content, it reads displays hurry back. Next, this is how we can set the text of a span element, which we've already done, but we did it for the first child element. So in this case, we're going to create some text content that equals hi. And when we use span.text content, it does exactly what you might think. It takes welcome back exclamation point and just replaces it with hi. All right, so we've gone through that pretty quickly. It's in the text as well, and we just need to look at some examples of when we use it in our applications. So here are some common methods of the document and element interfaces: query selector and query selector all. We've now been through query selector twice. Query selector all, let's say we targeted a span that was in a page of several spans, it would grab all the spans. And these are the common methods of the element interface. Has attribute, which would tell us whether something had an attribute, and you have to pass it the tag itself, or the attribute itself. There's get attribute to actually get the attribute. Set attribute, which sets it but takes a second parameter, which is the value which you're setting, and the idea of removing an attribute. So we'll get to that in just a second. This is one way to create an array of anchor tags in a document. So when I do links equals document.querySelectorAll, I will get every single anchor tag in that page. Let's take a look at this, for example. We've got a collection of images here, all in an unordered list with an ID called image list. So what we can do is use document query selector image list and then list.querySelectorAll li, and that would get us an array of li elements between that list item. So you have to grab something before you can use query selector all generally. Otherwise, you could say, okay, document.querySelector li, and that would work as well. It's usually web pages are so complicated and convoluted that you try to get the parent element and then do your query selector all, because it'll cut down on how many things you get. So here comes has attribute. What we're going to be doing here is trying to test for and get an attribute. So if list has attribute class, then class attribute equals list.getAttributeClass. Take a look back here. It doesn't have a class, does it? Nope. So what we can do is set an attribute that is a class and make it equal to open. Or we can remove that attribute called class from the list. So what we just done there is add a class to our list, which is equal to the image list. All right, so UL would have a class, and then we set it for open, and then we removed it. Okay, so the DOM level 2 spec, which is the most recent, is, let me get this link here because I want to show it to you real quick. This is one of the issues with PowerPoint. It's just so difficult sometimes to manage, but I'm going to be very humble with this, and we're just going to take a look at it because nothing beats interrupting a PowerPoint, right? So this is the top level 2 span, and basically you go to the object definitions. I mean, you can go through this whole thing forever, but it talks about everything that you can put inside an HTML element. This is the book, friends. When we go to like link, title, meta, base, all of them, index, style, body, they go kind of in order. Like right now we're kind of really focusing on forms. And we can see the form element attribute, and you can see elements length, name, character set, action, all the things that we can apply to a form. Okay? So this is where your book on HTML is, and I don't know if you've ever seen it before, but it's a very handy link to look at the specs for. And honestly, if you're not into that, when you validate your code, when you validate your HTML, and you want to make sure you validate the JavaScript's rendering of your HTML code as well, because if you're using JavaScript to create HTML tags, you have to make sure those are done well. But my point is, this spec is what those code validators that you learn in the HTML class, that's what they follow. And that's what makes code valid. So if you choose not to look at the complexity of that w3.org site, and you want to just go validate your code all the time, you'll be fine. So these are typical properties available with the DOM HTML spec. So the elements that they can apply to, like everything can have an ID tag, everything can have a title tag, everything can have a class, everything can have a tag. So div h1, whatever, all those things can be applied to any element. An anchor tag, for example, has ahrefs. Images have sources. They have alt tags. Inputs can have disabled. So these are all typical. It's not the full list, but it does tell you that you can't really have a form tag with a source attribute. Okay, it doesn't make sense. But these are just reminders of what we went over in depth in the HTML class. So now to the DOM HTML specification. Now what we can do is really simplify our code here. We can get an image tag source attribute just by using hashtag image if we do image element. But what we can do is once we get the ID of an image, which is hashtag image, we can do get attribute source. So what we've done here is, let's say we have image source tag, image source equals tiger.jpg. If we do image element dot get attribute source, we would get, lion.jpg is right in front of me. We've got tigers and lions on the brain because they're all throughout this presentation. But what we can do is grab the tiger.jpg and then set the attribute for lion.jpg, which is, kind of what we need to do. A lot of times with dynamic galleries, you want to replace those images based on a click, and that's how we can do it. We can also get and set the same attribute with the DOM HTML spec. So if I alert the image element source, now I can figure out if it's tiger.jpg and just do image element dot source equals lion.jpg. So there's the core specification on the top where we're getting the attribute, and then there's also the HTML spec where we just take the attribute itself and replace it. So there are other examples of using DOM HTML specifications. Remember, last slide was just simply going back and targeting the source tag itself without using get attribute or set attribute. So what we can do is use document.querySelectorAll, grab the links, right, which is a collection, hit the first one, which is links block 0, because the collection acts like an array, and use the dot syntax to grab its ID. So first link ID would be the ID of the first link. We can also get the ahref of any anchor tag just by targeting the ID of that section and finding the href. So those are really handy things that should be known. How to set and get the class attribute of an element with two class names, what we can do is target the div, a tag called div, get its class name and make it equal to open space plus, so it has two classes, open and plus. And then if we have constant class names, that would equal div.className, which is both. So we're not only getting the class name, we're setting the class name. Other examples of this, we can get the tag attribute of the first element of an array. So take a look at this. We have links, which equals querySelectorAll, again, a collection of links. And if we do links 0.tagName, we would find its own tag name, which is going to be A for anchor. We could also disable or enable an element just by targeting its disabled property. So disabled on an input type would make it, let's say it was a text area, it would make it grayed out and you couldn't enter it. This is one handy way of validation, is not letting like a button be submitted unless you were able to complete the input type correctly. And sometimes you see, like let's say there was a password that needed to be, alphanumeric with maybe one punctuation character, and the button is grayed down until you hit that form. All right, so more stuff on element interfaces. So class list is, again, the list of classes. Common properties of the DOM token list object is length and value. So those are all things that work with forms and input types. The value of a form element or the length of characters in that form element. And common methods of the DOM token list object are also whether something contains something, whether you want to add something, remove something, replace something, or toggle something. These are all part of a lot of it depends on what comes into a form. So let's take a look at some of these in action. Like an HTML label element, we've got class equals first, welcome to our first website. Well, if we get an element object for the label object, all we have to do is query selector h2. Once we get heading 2, we get everything about that h2. We get its welcome to our website, we get its class. We could add another CSS class to that element object. By using classlist.add blue, at that point it would be first and blue. Or we could replace a CSS class with another CSS class. If we replaced blue with red, we would get red. And then we can even remove red. So add, replace, and remove all are great ways to control not only CSS classes, but other elements, other attributes. This is a great example of how to toggle a CSS class. So if I have heading CSS class list toggle blue, and then have it 3 times, it would toggle back and forth and back and forth. So what you could do is you're toggling off and on blue. So basically what's happening, and I wanted to show you an example, but we'll just leave it as this. So what's happening is, let's say you had toggle blue on, and blue was to turn something blue. And you had an event that would toggle it. When you toggled blue, it would remove the class, re-add the class, remove the class, re-add the class, remove the class, and re-add the class. And you can always check for that CSS class to see if the toggle's working by using contains. So if heading to class list contains blue, well, let's go ahead and add bold. And if not, let's remove bold. So toggles can be multiple things. We can change the color, we can change the typography, but the toggle will change something back and forth. It basically removes and adds, whatever you're talking about. You don't have to get caught up in, like, this is depending on CSS classes. A lot more things get toggled. You could toggle inner HTML, things like that. All right, so terms. Document object model, again, is the collection of elements that make up a web page. A node is an element inside the DOM, that one that can be targeted with JavaScript. The DOM core specification is things when we use like the get attribute, set attribute, has attribute, we're targeting the core specifically. Whereas when we do DOM HTML specification at the end, do you remember we targeted source? So we went right after the image and targeted the source. We didn't like add an attribute, we didn't remove an attribute, we targeted its source and made an equal sign and assigned it a new value, which was a new image. The interface itself is exactly what you'd think. It's the interface of the DOM map, the map tree. And DOM scripting is when we use JavaScript to control all the DOM elements and certain things about our web page. So we're basically scripting around getting elements around and outside elements.